He was small, and the city was not. A child carried through the gates of Rome by his aunt, arriving from the provincial quiet of Cordoba, a place of measured proportions and familiar distances, where the sounds of a morning were the sounds of a morning and nothing more. Rome was not like that. The streets at the Porta Capena pressed in from every side, carts grinding over stone, voices overlapping in a dozen regional accents, the smell of baking bread and animal dung and river water all arriving at once, the scale of everything asserting itself without apology or introduction. The child held on. The ant carried him forward into it. That child was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, born somewhere around 4 BCE in Cordoba, a Roman city on the far edge of the empire's western reach, in a province called Baetica that supplied Rome with its olive oil and its silver, and on occasion its writers. His father was Seneca the Elder, a man of letters known for his collections of rhetoric, a man who took education with considerable seriousness and who brought his family to the capital to give his sons the best formation a serious mind could arrange. The aunt, his mother's sister, whose name history has not saved, but whose presence runs quietly through Seneca's later letters, made herself responsible for the youngest boy's health and advancement from the beginning. She would prove to be one of the few constants in a life that would be defined over and over again by displacement. The crossing from Cordoba to Rome was a long one, and Seneca's own memory of it, in the letters he wrote decades later, carries a particular quality of double vision, the child moving toward a world whose demands he could not yet imagine, and the old man looking back at that crossing with full knowledge of what it had been the beginning of. He did not, in those later letters, describe Rome's gates as a threshold of promise or arrival. He described them as an entry into noise, the philosophical significance of that noise he had taken most of a lifetime to understand. His illness came early, asthma, and what his physicians called tuberculosis of the lungs, a condition that in the ancient world was understood imprecisely and treated with remedies of varying usefulness. Egypt was sometimes prescribed. The dry heat, the low humidity, the air thought to be good for failing lungs, and Seneca at some point made that journey too, staying long enough to absorb something of its culture and its quieter pace before returning to Rome. But the illness did not leave with him when he returned. It became instead a persistent companion, a condition that reasserted itself across the decades with what Seneca described in his letters to his friend Lucilius as sudden and absolute completeness. An attack would arrive, and the breath would not come, and the body would become the only thing in the world for however long the attack lasted. He called it, later, meditatio mortis, a rehearsal for death. He did not mean this as a metaphor. The attacks felt final. They had the texture of endings, and then the breath would return, and the world would reconstitute itself around him, and Seneca would notice that he had survived again and continue. What he found in that survival was not relief in any ordinary sense. It was something cooler and more interesting. He had been placed, without choosing it, in proximity to the thing that philosophy had always claimed to be its most important subject, and he had found that proximity, however unwelcome, however physically agonizing, forced a clarity that more comfortable circumstances did not provide. Philosophy, he came to believe, was not something one did in the abstract. It was something the circumstances of a life demanded. If the life was paying attention, his circumstances had been demanding it since childhood. The schools of Rome took the young Seneca and gave him what they gave the sons of ambitious families: rhetoric, literature, grammar, the whole elaborate apparatus of a Roman education designed to produce men who could speak well in the forum and manage well in the Senate. He was good at it, better than good. He had a particular quality of mind that his tutors recognized early, a capacity for the striking phrase and the unexpected angle of approach, and this combination made him visible in the courts and in the Senate at an age when visibility was still relatively safe. He studied philosophy alongside the rhetoric and found in it something the rhetoric did not offer, a set of questions that did not resolve into winning arguments, that remained open after the best case had been made, that seemed to be about something the legal and political life around him was not quite touching. He studied under the Stoic Attalus, a teacher he remembered with something close to reverence in his later letters. He studied under the Sexti, a father and son who taught a rigorous, morally demanding philosophy that owed debts to both Stoicism and Pythagoreanism, and who practiced what they argued for in ways that Seneca found, even decades later, worth mentioning. But Rome in the early 1st century CE was not a comfortable place to be brilliant and visible and interested in philosophy. The Emperor Caligula, on whom Seneca made an early impression through his oratory in the Senate, reportedly considered having him killed on the grounds that the quality of his speeches was an irritant. The sources are not entirely consistent on the details of this story, and Seneca himself did not record it directly, but there is something in its texture that fits the period, a city in which political talent, like any other concentration of force, could attract the attention of those who did not want it concentrated in someone other than themselves. Seneca survived Caligula's reign, as he would later survive other dangers, with the particular quality of managed invisibility that the period required of those who wished to continue existing. The reign of Claudius, which followed, brought a different kind of reckoning. In 41 CE, Seneca was exiled to the island of Corsica. The charge was adultery with Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister and Claudius's niece, a charge whose basis has been disputed by historians ever since, the political motivations behind it being considerably clearer than the personal ones. He was 45 years old, at the height of his rhetorical and philosophical powers, and he was sent to an island off the western coast of the Italian peninsula, barren and remote, where the wind off the Tyrrhenian Sea offered no compensating hospitality for what had been taken away. He stayed there for 8 years. What he did in those 8 years was right. The 3 essays he composed during the Corsican exile, addressed to his mother Helvia, to the powerful freedman Polybius, who might be persuaded to advocate for his return, and exploring grief and consolation more broadly, constitute the earliest sustained evidence of Seneca engaging adversity not merely as a condition to be endured, but as a philosophical subject to be examined from within. The consolation to his mother Helvia is among the strangest and most affecting pieces of philosophical writing from the ancient world. A man in exile writing a letter of philosophical comfort to the woman who loves him and is suffering on his account, arguing with full philosophical seriousness that neither of them need be destroyed by what has happened to them, while the wind comes through whatever window his writing space had, and the island beyond it offers nothing in the way of reassurance. There is something specific and important about that image. Seneca on Corsica, composing philosophical arguments for equanimity in the exact conditions he is arguing. Equanimity is possible within. He was not writing from a position of safety about the theoretical availability of inner peace. He was writing from a position of enforced displacement, stripped of the city and the forum and the household comforts his adult life had organized itself around, reaching for a philosophical position, not because it was convenient, but because the alternative was to be destroyed by circumstances that showed no sign of improving. The essays written on Corsica are not the works of a man who has achieved Stoic composure and is reporting the view from altitude. They are the works of a man who is working out, under pressure, whether the composure he is arguing for is actually possible, and finding provisionally that it is, and that the finding is worth recording. He returned to Rome in 49 CE, recalled from exile through the influence of Agrippina the Younger, who had become Claudius's new wife, and who wanted Seneca as tutor to her son. Her son was 12 years old, and his name was Nero. Seneca's next 15 years would be spent in the intimacy of that connection, first as tutor, then as advisor, then as the figure who, during the early years of Nero's reign, exercised something recognizable as moderating influence over the behavior of an emperor with considerable capacity for moderation's opposite. The ancient historians, looking back on the first years of Nero's rule, describe them with a phrase that carried the weight of retrospective judgment: the quinquennium Neronus, the 5 good years, the period in which the governance of Rome appeared to function with something approaching wisdom and proportion. The attribution of those years to Seneca's influence is not simply the claim of a philosopher's admirer. It reflects the practical reality that an advisor who has thought carefully about the relationship between power and ethics, who has written extensively about mercy and restraint, and the corrupting effects of absolute authority, and who has the ear of the person exercising that authority, can, under the right conditions, make governance measurably less terrible than it would otherwise be. Seneca did not believe that philosophy was for private consolation only. He believed it was for the world, including the world of courts and senates and men who held power over other men. The early years of Nero's reign were in some measure the test of that belief. The test did not sustain its favorable results. What happened to Nero's character in the late 50s and early 60s of the first century is one of the better documented deteriorations in Roman imperial history. The ancient sources recording it with the particular mixture of horror and interpretive energy that attaches to power going visibly wrong. The philosopher watching this from inside the court, composing during this same period a treatise on mercy addressed directly to Nero, arguing with patient philosophical care for the case that a ruler's self-interest was best served by restraint and humanity, was in a position that required a specific kind of steadiness to inhabit without despair. The treatise on mercy, De Clementia, was not written from a position of naivety. Seneca knew what Nero was capable of. He had been watching. The treatise was a philosophical argument addressed to a real person whose behavior was already making the argument's premises look optimistic, and the composing of it required holding 2 things in mind simultaneously: what the argument required if taken seriously, and what the man addressed by the argument was actually doing. His attempts to withdraw from the court in the early 60s CE, to retire, to be released from his proximity to Nero, and from the ethical entanglements that proximity required, are recorded by Tacitus with the particular quality of a historian who understood what was at stake in them. Seneca asked on more than one occasion to be allowed to step back. He offered to return his wealth, which had accumulated to considerable size during his years at court. He argued, in terms that his Stoic philosophy entirely supported, that the accumulation of political engagement and material prosperity was incompatible with the philosophical life he wanted to be living. Nero, according to Tacitus, declined these requests with words that had the sound of affection and the quality of refusal. The philosopher could not cleanly extract himself from the political life he had argued in his writing should be held lightly and never confused with genuine goods. This tension between the civic duty that Stoic philosophy recognized as a genuine obligation and the preservation of the inner integrity that Stoic philosophy identified as the only thing worth absolutely protecting was one that Seneca never resolved in his own life. And his awareness of this fact gives his later letters to Lucilius a quality that his earlier essays do not quite have. He writes in those letters, as a man who knows that the distance between what he has argued and what he has been able to live is not small, and who has decided that honesty about that distance is more useful than the pretense of having closed it. He was not, in the letters to Lucilius, presenting himself as an achieved philosopher. He was presenting himself as a still struggling one, and the letters carry that quality, the quality of a man who has the arguments and has lived among them for decades, and who remains, at the end of all that, still working on it. The last years came in 65 CE, when a conspiracy against Nero, known to history as the Pisonian conspiracy, was discovered, and the emperor's response reached across the social and intellectual life of Rome in a series of forced deaths and executions that touched writers, senators, soldiers, and eventually Seneca himself. His connection to the conspiracy was, and remains, unclear. Whether he knew of the plot, whether he endorsed it, whether his name was included by the conspirators as a potential successor to Nero, or simply as a figure whose reputation gave the enterprise a philosophical cover, none of this is known with certainty. What is known is that Nero's order arrived. Seneca was to die. Tacitus's account of the death is the most sustained single piece of writing we have about Seneca, and it has a quality that the historian's prose achieves in its most concentrated moments, the quality of an event being recorded with full awareness of its symbolic weight, every detail placed with the deliberateness of a man who understands that he is writing something that will be read as long as there are people who read such things. Seneca, informed of the order, asked for his will. The officer present refused. He turned to his friends, who had gathered in the room and who were weeping. He addressed them, according to Tacitus, with composed words, reminding them that they had the resources that philosophy had given them, that what was about to happen was something philosophy had been preparing all of them for, that the emotional response appropriate to the moment was not grief, but the philosophical recognition that everything which can be lost was always going to be lost, and that this had been known from the beginning. His wife Paulina, present in the room, said that she wished to die with him. Seneca did not dissuade her, though he expressed, according to Tacitus, something like appreciation for the courage the wish represented. The veins were opened. Seneca's body, aged and thin from years of illness and restricted diet, did not bleed quickly. The process was extended, and Seneca, through the extension of it, continued to speak. Tacitus records that scribes were present, taking down the words as they were said, a detail of such particular specificity that it has lodged itself in the way this death is remembered across the centuries. The philosopher, in the act of dying, was still composing. The final words were still being recorded. The practice that had organized his entire adult life, the practice of setting philosophical thought into language that could be passed on, preserved, used by people who were not yet born, continued into the room where the practice was ending. Nero later sent soldiers to revoke the permission for Paulina's death, and she survived, though Tacitus records that she lived the rest of her life with a pallor that bore the marks of what had happened in that room. Seneca, whose blood had not flowed quickly enough, was carried into a bath and died of the vapor. The scribes had the words, what Tacitus understood, and what gives his account of the death its particular resonance across the long distance between his writing and any reading of it is that the scene was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a life that had been arguing toward exactly this moment since at least the Corsican exile, and possibly since the asthma attacks of young adulthood, and possibly since the first time Attalus had asked him in the schools of Rome to consider the possibility that virtue was the only thing worth unconditionally protecting. The opened veins were not a departure from the philosophical project. They were the place the philosophical project had always been, at its most honest, pointing toward. This is not to say that the death was a triumph, or that the circumstances surrounding it were not what they were, a forced death ordered by a man whose character had darkened steadily over a decade and a half, a death that came at the end of a political entanglement, whose costs Seneca had recognized clearly and been unable, in the end, to fully avoid. The Stoic tradition did not require that the circumstances of a death be good ones. It required only that the response to them be as free as the circumstances permitted. On that measure, and on the evidence of Tacitus, who was not a man given to unearned praise, the measure was met. There is a way of reading a life from a great and gentle distance, which is the only way, finally, to read a life at all, that attends to what the life was made of, rather than to the judgment of whether it succeeded or failed by the standards it was applying to itself. Seneca's life contained illness and exile and political entrapment and forced death. It also contained the letters to Lucilius, which were still being read 18 centuries after they were written. It contained the consolation essays composed on a barren island to a mother who was suffering on his account, essays that found in philosophy not an escape from the conditions of exile, but a genuine philosophical resource available inside those conditions. It contained the treatises on anger, on mercy, on the length of life, on providence, on the good life, and how to live toward it, even in the knowledge of falling short. It contained the years at Nero's court, with all the ethical costs of those years, and the attempts to withdraw from them that were repeatedly refused, and the failure to cleanly resolve the tension between civic duty and inner integrity, a failure that his philosophy had always acknowledged was possible, and which his honesty had always refused to paper over. What the life did not contain was safety in any comfortable sense of the word. The philosophy that came out of that life was not the philosophy of a man protected from what he was writing about. It was the philosophy of a man who had encountered the worst possibilities of his historical situation: disease, displacement, political captivity, forced death, and had reached across the whole length of a working life for something that could survive them. The reaching was imperfect. The philosophy it produced was not a system in which every problem had been solved and every contradiction resolved. It was a practice, a sustained, imperfect, honest attempt to bring the quality of one's thinking into correspondence with the quality of one's living, and to keep trying even when the correspondence was not achieved. A life can be measured, in the end, not by what it avoided, and Seneca's life avoided very little of what fortune had to deliver, but by the quality of attention it brought to what it could not escape. The child carried through Rome's gates into the noise of the city, the young orator holding his brilliance carefully in the presence of dangerous men, the philosopher writing consolation on a barren island to the woman he loved, while the wind came through the window and the island offered nothing back. These were not separate figures in a broken life. They were the same person, carrying the same questions through a succession of conditions that tested them, and finding that the questions held, and that the holding of them was, in the end, the thing worth carrying. The scribes had the words remained. Zeno was standing in the open colonnade of the Athenian Agora on a morning that had already taken everything from him. Behind him, the walls of the Stoa Poikile were covered in painted scenes of war, the Battle of Marathon, the fall of Troy, the long violence of the Persian campaigns rendered in pigment and pine resin on wooden panels that the morning light caught at a low angle. In front of him, the open square of the Agora was already beginning to fill with merchants and citizens and the ordinary noise of a city conducting its business. He was teaching, not inside a building, not inside an academy with walls and a gate and a subscription, but here in the colonnaded public air, where anyone passing could slow down and listen and walk on again, and where the philosophy could not seal itself away from the world it was trying to address. He had arrived in Athens from Cyprus some years before, a merchant carrying a cargo of purple dye, and the sea had taken the cargo and the ship and everything he had built. By his own later account, given in various forms and probably shaped by the needs of a tradition that finds a good story useful, the shipwreck was the beginning of something rather than the end of one. He walked into a bookshop in Athens and sat down with a text of Socrates, and what he found there was enough to keep him. The fact that the tradition preserved this story at all, the merchant, the wreck, the book, the colonnade, suggests something the Stoics themselves noticed and approved, that a philosophy organized around indifference to material loss had an unusually honest relationship with its own origins. What Zeno began teaching in that colonnade, around 300 years before the Common Era, would spend the next 6 centuries moving through the Mediterranean world and through some of the most capable minds that world produced. It would arrive, among other places, at the writing table of a wealthy Roman with damaged lungs, a banished man turned imperial advisor, who would take the rough architecture of what Zeno had built and make of it something warmer and more personal and more honest about the distance between its ideals and the life any human being can actually manage. To understand what Seneca was working with, it helps to stay for a while in that painted colonnade and feel the shape of the system Zeno was assembling, not as a set of rules, not as a list of positions to be memorized and agreed with, more as a way of seeing that, once genuinely held, tends to reorganize everything it touches. The central claim was this: there is a single rational principle that runs through all of existence, not behind it, not governing it from a distance, but threaded through every particle of matter and every moment of time, the way heat is threaded through something that is genuinely warm all the way through. The Greeks had a word for this, logos, which had already meant speech and reason and the principle by which things could be understood, before the Stoics added to it the claim that it was not only the instrument of understanding, but the substance of reality itself. The universe, on this account, is not a collection of separate things that happen to follow rational laws. It is reason, extended into matter, thinking itself through time. The word does not carry its full weight in a single encounter. It needs to be held for a while. The logos, as the Stoics conceived it, was sometimes described as a rational fire, not fire as destruction, not the consuming kind, but fire as the animating energy that keeps a living thing warm and active and capable of responding to its world. The universe breathes on this account. It contracts and expands across vast cycles of time, returning periodically to a state of pure rational fire before extending itself again into the familiar matter of rocks and air and the bodies of living things. Each human mind, on this view, is not separate from the logos, but a small and temporary expression of it, a flame briefly differentiated from the fire, capable for a short interval of knowing and choosing and speaking, before being returned to the larger whole from which it briefly came. This is not a comfortable idea, in the way that, say, The idea of a personal God who cares individually about each human fate is comfortable. It offers a different kind of comfort, larger, cooler, less personal, and for some temperaments, more genuinely steadying. The universe is not indifferent. It is not arbitrary. It is not the grinding machine of a purely material world in which events happen for no reason and suffering means nothing. It is, on Stoic terms, saturated with reason, organized by it, moving according to it, and the suffering that occurs within it is woven into a rationally ordered pattern that the limited perspective of any individual life cannot fully see. Zeno would have paused here, probably because this is the place where the philosophy meets its most honest difficulty, and the Stoics were not in the habit of moving past difficulties without acknowledging them. If the universe is rationally ordered, and every event within it is part of that rational order, then the suffering of an innocent person, the illness of a child, the loss of everything a person has spent a life building, is not a flaw in the order, but a feature of it. The Stoics knew this conclusion was uncomfortable. They did not soften it. They argued instead that what appears as misfortune from within the narrow frame of a single life looks different from the wider perspective of the rational whole. The loss that destroys one part of the pattern may be precisely what sustains another. The event that feels arbitrary from the inside is at a scale too large for individual perception, entirely purposeful. Whether this is persuasive or not is a question that has been sitting open for a very long time, and nothing about the intervening centuries has brought it closer to a settled answer. The Stoic response to suffering was never primarily theoretical. The theory was there. It held the philosophical structure together, but what the theory was in service of was a practical way of living in a world where suffering was certain, and the only question was what a person was going to do with it. Zeno taught in the colonnade, and the passers-by slowed and listened. The morning light moved across the painted battle scenes on the wall behind him. A merchant who had lost everything was explaining to anyone who would hear why the loss had not destroyed what mattered. The city moved around him. Seneca would read him and read about him and find in the gap between Zeno's position and his own life's experience something he could use. One of the most important things Zeno argued, and the Stoics after him elaborated with considerable care, was a claim about the nature of goodness. Not the nature of the good life in a general sense. That was a question every school was working on, but the specific question of what kind of thing a good actually is. The ordinary answer, the answer that feels obvious enough that it barely seems worth defending, is that goods are things like health and wealth and the love of people who matter to you, and a comfortable place to live, and a life long enough to do what you meant to do in it. These feel like goods. They feel like goods in the way that warmth feels warm, immediately, directly, without requiring any argument. To say they are not genuine goods requires a degree of philosophical nerve. The Stoics had that nerve. They argued that none of these things, not health, not wealth, not reputation, not a long life, not the company of those you love, is a genuine good. They are preferred when available. A Stoic sage who could choose between health and illness, all else being equal, would choose health. A Stoic practitioner who had the option of comfort would not voluntarily refuse it for the sake of appearing indifferent. The Stoics were not interested in suffering for its own sake. What they insisted on was a precise philosophical distinction between things that are genuinely and unconditionally good, and things that are merely preferable when circumstances allow. The distinction matters because of what it does to the experience of loss. If health is a genuine good, then its loss is a genuine bad, an evil, in the old sense of the word, something that diminishes the quality of the life it takes from. And if that is true, then the loss of health is a legitimate source of suffering, and the suffering is not a failure of understanding, but an appropriate response to a genuine deprivation. The Stoics did not accept this. They argued that health, like all the things people ordinarily treat as genuine goods, is what the Greek philosophical tradition called an adiaphoron, an indifferent, meaning that its presence or absence does not, in itself, determine the quality of a human life in the deepest sense. The Greek term for what the Stoics called preferred among indifferents was proegmenon, and a serious student of the school encountered this word alongside its philosophical weight, that health was preferable to illness, wealth to poverty, good reputation to shame, but none of these preferences reached the level of genuine goodness. They could be pursued, reasonably without attachment. They could be lost, hard as that loss was, without the core of the life being damaged. What then was a genuine good? Only one thing: the quality of the will, the character of the choices a person makes, the degree to which a human life is lived from its own rational center, in accordance with the logos that both pervades the universe and animates the mind doing the living. A person who has that, who has trained their will to respond to experience with the wisdom and proportion and steady integrity that constitute genuine virtue, has, on Stoic terms, the only good that fortune cannot touch, because fortune operates entirely on the outside. It can take the health, the wealth, the reputation, the years. It cannot reach into the quality of a person's choices and corrupt them without the cooperation of the person being corrupted. This is a position that sounds at first encounter like a philosopher's trick, a way of defining the good so narrowly that nothing can threaten it, and then claiming victory over adversity on the basis of a definition. Seneca knew this objection. He addressed it in various forms throughout his writing life. The response the Stoics gave was not to deny the difficulty of the position, but to ask the objector to sit with it honestly, to genuinely consider whether the things they were calling goods were actually delivering what goods are supposed to deliver. What goods are supposed to deliver, which is not pleasure or comfort or security, but something more like the experience of being fully and worthily alive. The four virtues the Stoics named, practical wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, were not understood as separate qualities that a person might possess in different degrees, the way a person might be braver than they are wise, or more just than they are temperate. They were understood as four aspects of a single underlying condition, the condition of a rational mind, operating in full accordance with its own nature. A person who genuinely had one had all of them, because they were facets of the same gem, the way that a single light, passing through a well-cut stone, produces not four separate lights, but four angles of the same one. Practical wisdom was the capacity to see clearly what a situation actually required, not what fear or desire or habit suggested, but what a calm and well-trained rational attention could identify as the genuinely right response. Justice was the expression of that wisdom in relation to other people, the orientation toward each person's genuine good, including those whose suffering created inconvenience, or whose claims conflicted with one's own immediate preferences. Courage was the same rational clarity applied to circumstances that threatened what was preferred, the ability to hold one's ground without distortion, without the recoiling that fear produces when it is allowed to function as a guide rather than a signal. Temperance was the proportion that a well-ordered will naturally maintained in relation to appetite and pleasure, not the repression of desire, but its calibration, the difference between drinking and drinking until judgment fails. Zeno taught all of this in the colonnade, where the morning air moved through from the street. The painted Persians were still being defeated on the wall behind him. People with ordinary lives and ordinary concerns passed through the agora and slowed, some of them, to listen. The philosophy was being conducted in the open, which was not only a practical arrangement, but a philosophical statement. This is not esoteric knowledge for a protected few. This is how to live. Anyone can hear it. 400 years later, Seneca received the inheritance of what Zeno had built, and he did something with it that the school's founders would have recognized and in their more honest moments appreciated. He admitted that he was not living up to it. This was not, by the standards of the tradition, a small thing. The Stoics had a concept for the fully realized wise person, the sapiens, who had completed the work of rational self-ordering to the degree that virtue was genuine and unwavering rather than effortful and intermittent. The sapiens was not merely trying to act wisely. The sapiens had arrived at a condition in which wisdom was the natural expression of a character that had been worked on long enough and hard enough that it no longer required effort in the way that a beginner's practice requires effort. Almost no one in the history of the school claimed to have met a sapiens. Diogenes of Sinope was sometimes proposed, Socrates, occasionally Cato. The category was less a description of an achieved human type than a philosophical North Star, a direction in which to travel. Seneca did not pretend to be approaching the horizon. He wrote, with unusual transparency for a person operating in a tradition that valued self-presentation, about the distance between what he knew and what he was. He described days when fear returned in forms he thought he had addressed. He described the pull of the same pleasures and the same anxieties the philosophy was supposed to have reorganized. He described himself not as a sage, but as a patient who knew his own illness and was managing it with imperfect success. The honesty was not self-flagellation. It was something more useful, a demonstration that the philosophy remained philosophically serious even in the hands of someone genuinely struggling with it, and that the struggling was part of the practice rather than an indication that the practice had failed. This was where Seneca's relationship to the tradition diverged from the posture of a strict school adherent, and the divergence is interesting. He read Epicurus, he read Plato, he cited figures from schools the Stoics had argued against and continued arguing against, and he did so without apology. The philosophical letter he wrote to a friend might open with a line from Epicurus, not as a concession or an error to be corrected, but as the best available way into a problem that Epicurus had seen clearly, even if Epicurus's framework for addressing it was not the one Seneca finally preferred. He described himself in one letter as belonging to no school's camp, not because he lacked commitments, but because the commitment he felt most strongly was to inquiry rather than to a flag. The Stoics, on the most orthodox reading of the school's positions, had reasons to be suspicious of this approach. Doctrinal coherence mattered. The rational structure of the system depended on its parts fitting together, and borrowing from incompatible frameworks risked compromising the integrity of the whole. Seneca was aware of this objection. He managed it not by ignoring it, but by treating philosophy as something that lived in the practitioner rather than in the doctrine, not a system to be defended, but a practice to be deepened, in which the test of any idea was whether it helped a person actually live better, with more clarity and more steadiness and more genuine responsiveness to what the day delivered. This pragmatic orientation had a cost and a benefit. The cost was that Seneca's stoicism is not always tidy. He can be found in tension with himself across different works, holding a position in one letter that a careful reader can complicate by going to an earlier one. The benefit was that the philosophy remained genuinely alive in his hands, not a monument to be maintained, but a practice being continually tested against experience and revised where experience demanded revision. The Athenian colonnade had been a public space. Seneca's writing table was private, letters sent to a friend, essays sent to people navigating specific difficulties, treatises written in the awareness that Nero's court was capable of treating intellectual independence as a political offense. The philosophy had moved from the open air of the agora to the more complicated air of an empire in which thinking carefully could have consequences. And yet what Seneca was doing with the inheritance he had received was at its root the same thing Zeno had been doing in the morning light of Athens, trying to give someone a way to meet what the day was going to bring. The Stoic system had one more structural claim that deserves to be felt before it is named, because it is the one that everything else in the tradition depends on, and without which the advice to prefer virtue over external goods is simply a demand that people stop caring about the things they most naturally care about, which is not philosophy, but cruelty. The claim is that the rational principle of the universe and the rational capacity of the human mind are the same thing, not analogous, not parallel. The logos that organizes matter and time is the same logos that a human being exercises when they think clearly and act wisely. This means that a life lived from one's rational center is not only a good human life, it is a life in alignment with the structure of reality itself. The Stoics called this living according to nature, but nature for them did not mean the nature of a biological organism following its appetites. It meant the nature of a rational being participating, through the quality of its choices, in the rational order that constitutes the universe. What follows from this, and the Stoics were careful to draw out the implication, is that no external circumstance can ever fully separate a human being from what is most real and most valuable. The logos is not something that can be taken away. It can be obscured, misused, ignored, the way a fire can be covered or starved of what it needs to burn clearly. But the capacity itself, the rational nature that is both a person's specific identity and their share in the cosmic whole, is not among the things that fortune can touch. Exile cannot remove it. Illness cannot corrupt it. Political power cannot confiscate it. The Stoics meant this not as consolation, but as a description of what they took to be a genuine structural feature of the human situation. Whether it is persuasive depends on what a person is willing to grant about the nature of reality. The Stoics asked for quite a lot. They asked for the belief that the universe is rational, which cannot be confirmed from inside it in the way that individual facts can be confirmed. They asked for the belief that virtue is genuinely sufficient for a good life, which contradicts the testimony of almost every person who has ever suffered an irreversible loss. They asked for a degree of philosophical commitment that looks from the outside like a kind of faith, not in a personal God, but in the rational order of things. And yet the practice the Stoics built on top of these beliefs did not require the beliefs to be fully settled in advance. A person could begin with the practices and find over time that the beliefs they had provisionally held came to feel more genuinely like descriptions of their experience rather than impositions on it. Seneca's letters work this way. He does not begin with the grand claims and derive the practical advice. He begins with a specific human difficulty, the anxiety of an upcoming journey, the noise of a street outside a window, the approach of an age at which the body begins to require more careful attention, and works from there toward the philosophical resources available to meet it. The doctrines arrive after the difficulty. They arrive as what they actually are, tools that a person under pressure had found useful and wanted to pass on. Zeno, standing in the colonnade, the painted battles behind him, the merchants passing through the morning agora, the ship already gone, the cargo already at the bottom of the sea, the philosophy beginning in the particular kind of attention that follows genuine loss, not the despair that follows loss when a person believes the lost thing was a genuine good, but the specific clarity that can arrive when a person has stopped believing that and is trying to find what remains. There is a line Seneca writes in one of his letters to Lucilius that functions as a small key to the whole tradition he was working within. He writes of a person who is everywhere and therefore nowhere, nusquam est qui ubique estimated. The immediate context is distraction, the scattering of attention across too many places and too many concerns, the way a mind that is always moving toward the next thing never actually arrives anywhere. But the line carries the weight of the broader philosophical position. The logos is everywhere. The rational mind that participates in it is a specific thing with a specific location in time and a specific set of actual choices to make. The everywhere of the cosmic rational order finds its home, its actual, livable, inhabitable home, only in the particular here and now of a person who has chosen to think from their own center rather than to scatter their attention across everything fortune might deliver or withhold. This was not a position Seneca adopted all at once and then inhabited without difficulty. The letters make clear that the return to this center was something he performed repeatedly throughout a life that kept offering reasons to be drawn away from it. The practice was the returning. The philosophy was not the destination, but the discipline of knowing which direction to face, and then, with whatever attention remained after the noise and the anxiety and the demands of a complicated life had done their work, of facing it again. The morning in Athens was a long time ago. The colonnade has been gone for centuries. The painted walls that showed the Persians being defeated have not survived, though scholars know what they contained from descriptions that did. What survived was the practice, the argument that the only genuine goods are internal, that the rational order is both the universe's nature and a person's own deepest nature, that the loss of what fortune can give does not remove what fortune cannot reach. These ideas moved from Zeno through a long succession of schools and practitioners, and eventually to the writing table of a Roman who made them personal and imperfect and honest in a way that gave them a different kind of staying power. The sapiens, the fully wise person, was always distant, always a direction rather than a destination. The point was not to arrive, but to know which way to go, and to go that way, and to return to it when the day's noise had pulled attention elsewhere, and to go that way again. The philosophy did not promise comfort. It offered something the Stoics considered more valuable and more durable, a home inside the mind that required no permission from the world outside it, a ground that remained even when everything standing on it had been taken away. The question of whether that ground is really there, whether the Stoic account of the logos and the rational nature of the cosmos is true in the way that things in the world can be true, was not settled by Zeno, and Seneca did not settle it either. It remains where it has always been, in the company of the serious questions that serious inquiry reaches and does not resolve, which is precisely where philosophy is most honestly alive and most genuinely restful to inhabit, once the urgency of demanding an answer has finally been set aside. The columned portico of the agora caught the morning light from the east and held it for a while before the sun moved on. A person who had lost everything was explaining why the loss had not destroyed what mattered. The mind that hears this, any mind, in any century does not need to accept the explanation to feel the particular steadiness it comes from. That steadiness is its own kind of argument. It has been resting in the same place for a very long time, waiting without urgency to be found. Seneca is sitting at a plain table in his own villa, in the hour before the household has fully woken, and the bread in front of him is the coarse kind that servants eat rather than the kind he would ordinarily be served. The elaborate dining furniture is still in the room. The good oil lamps are still on their stands. The fabric draped over the far couch still carries the particular weight and color of expensive cloth. None of it has been moved. What has changed is only this. For these few days each month, he has chosen not to use any of it. He holds the bread in both hands, and what he notices first is not discomfort, but something more interesting, the discovery that the feared condition contains almost nothing of what the fear of it contained. The bread is bread. The morning is a morning. The life he had been quietly dreading, the loss of turns out to be, at its plainest, still entirely sufficient. This was not a performance of poverty. Seneca was careful about that distinction. The practice he described in one of his letters to Lucilius was not an exercise in self-punishment or theatrical suffering. It was something more precise and more useful. It was an experiment conducted by a man who noticed that a great deal of his anxiety about the future concerned conditions he had never actually experienced, and who decided that the most honest response to that observation was to experience them and see what they actually contained. Several days of plain food, rough clothing, the bare minimum, and then the return to ordinary comfort, carrying the knowledge that the minimum and the comfort were, in the final accounting, far closer in their actual content than the imagination had insisted they were. The gap between what was feared and what was found turned out to be occupied almost entirely by imagination, and imagination, once checked against reality, has a tendency to recede. There is something in this practice that goes beyond simple reassurance. The Roman world in which Seneca lived was one in which fortune moved quickly, and where men of standing had seen enough reversals to know that the comfortable life was never permanently secured. Seneca himself had watched wealth arrive and depart with the shifting of political alliances, and he wrote not as a man who had been insulated from that knowledge, but as one who had carried it for a long time and had found, over the course of that carrying, a method for reducing the particular quality of dread it produced. The method was not to acquire more safety. It was to discover that the conditions he feared were livable, and to discover this not through argument, but through brief and direct encounter. Having sat with the bread and the rough cloth, having spent the days in the manner of the life he might someday be left with, the fear did not dissolve entirely, but it changed in character. It became less a wall and more a door. What Seneca was engaging in had a name in his tradition, though the name matters less than what it describes. The practice was one of voluntary simplicity, a deliberate and temporary reduction of ordinary conditions, not toward suffering, but toward the discovery of how much of ordinary suffering is contributed by the imagination before any real hardship has arrived. The philosopher who has sat with the simple life, even briefly, and found it not catastrophic, carries a different relationship to the future than the philosopher who has only argued that it would probably be fine. Arguments about equanimity, taken alone, remain at a certain distance from the thing they are describing. Experience, even carefully bounded and deliberately chosen experience, closes that distance. This was the point. The practice was a kind of honest seeing. In the same letter, Seneca described how he felt when he returned to his ordinary circumstances after the voluntary days had ended. Not relief, exactly, something quieter than relief. The comfort of the household, the better food, the familiar ease, all of it was still there, and he moved back into it without guilt and without diminishment. The point was not that comfort was wrong or that wealth was something to be ashamed of. Seneca was quite clear on this throughout his writing. The Stoic tradition made space for what it called preferred indifference, things that were genuinely better to have than not to have, provided they were never confused with the things that genuinely mattered. Health was better than illness. Adequate food was better than hunger. A degree of material ease was better than its absence. The philosophical move was not to deny this, or to pretend the preference was irrational. The move was to hold these things in a particular way, to have them without needing them, to use them without being used by them, to enjoy the bread when it was good bread, and to find the plain bread, when it came, also entirely sufficient. This is a distinction that rewards sitting with, rather than merely acknowledging. To hold something loosely is not the same as not caring for it. The hand that holds loosely is still holding, the attention is still present. What has changed is the relationship to the possibility of loss. Seneca, writing in the morning with his good pen on good paper, was genuinely using those things and finding them genuinely useful. Seneca, sitting with the rough cloth and the plain bread, was also genuinely present. Neither experience was a denial of the other. The practice was not the permanent state. It was the regular reminder that made the permanent state something other than precarious. Seneca's essay on the length of life opens with a reversal that his readers 2,000 years ago and now would have arrived at with the familiar complaint already formed in their minds. Life is short, and there is not enough of it. The complaint was ancient before Seneca addressed it. It was ancient before the philosophers whose company he kept. It is ancient now, and Seneca's response at the opening of that essay is simply to disagree. Life is not short. It is adequate. It may even be generous if what one does with it is examined closely enough. The complaint about brevity, Seneca argued, is almost always a complaint that has been misdirected. The problem is not that life is insufficient in length. The problem is what has been done with the length it contains. That reversal, the familiar complaint dissolving and reforming into something more uncomfortable and more demanding, was the rhetorical move that opened the whole argument. Because the alternative to the complaint about brevity was not the comforting reassurance that there was plenty of time. The alternative was the recognition that time had been present all along, and that what had been treated as scarcity was closer to waste. This is, on any careful examination, a harder position to sit with than the original complaint. The person who blames life for being short is in an adversarial relationship with time itself, and adversarial relationships with time are among the most reliable ways of not using it. The person who recognizes that the hours have been present and not fully inhabited is in a different position entirely, one that carries the mild discomfort of seeing something clearly that one had been looking slightly past. The enemies of a fully experienced life, as Seneca named them in that essay, were not dramatic forces. They were not catastrophe or illness or the cruelty of circumstance, though all of those could shorten what was available. The enemies were quieter than that and more domestic. They were the habit of deferral, the persistent sense that the real life would begin later, when the current difficulties had resolved, when the arrangements were better, when the time was less pressured. They were the accumulation of unnecessary occupation, the filling of hours with activities that one had not chosen but had simply not refused, the slow colonization of days by other people's priorities. And they were the treatment of the present moment as a kind of waiting room, a threshold before the actual arrival of something more significant. Seneca had watched this happen to men of considerable talent and energy, watched them fill the years with the busyness of ambition and social obligation and the management of wealth, and then arrive at the end of it unable to say clearly what the years had been for. The life had not been short. It had been consumed before it was lived. What the essay argued for was something quite different from the simple injunction to slow down or be present, though it contained those things. What it argued for was the active, deliberate claiming of time as something genuinely owned rather than merely occupied. Seneca distinguished between time that was truly one's own, given to philosophy, to genuine friendship, to work that was chosen and held with full attention, and time that had been given away without examination to the demands and expectations of others. The first kind of time, even if measured in hours rather than years, could be experienced as full. The second kind of time, accumulated across decades, could be experienced when examined honestly as barely having happened. There is a precision in this distinction that is easy to miss if one moves past it too quickly. The claim was not that solitude was better than company, or that contemplation was more valuable than action. The claim was finer than that. The claim was about the quality of attention, whether a given hour was inhabited by the person living it, or whether it had been passed through more or less unconsciously, the mind elsewhere, the attention perpetually deferred to a future moment that would itself be deferred when it arrived. Seneca himself lived a life of considerable activity, considerable public engagement, considerable entanglement in the affairs of the world. The essay was not a call to retreat from all of that. It was a call to examine which parts of it were genuinely chosen and which had simply arrived and been accepted without scrutiny. Among the practices Seneca returned to most consistently across his letters and essays was one that pointed directly toward adversity rather than away from it. The name for it in the tradition was premeditatio malorum, the deliberate advance imagining of misfortune, and it was, on its surface, an unusual thing to recommend. The ordinary movement of a comfortable mind is away from the consideration of what might be lost, away from images of illness and poverty and the death of those who are close. The ordinary movement is toward optimism about the future, toward the assumption that current conditions will roughly persist, toward what might be called the default confidence of a life that has not recently been disrupted. In this ordinary movement, Seneca argued, was one of the more reliable sources of suffering, because when disruption arrived, as it always did, it arrived into a mind that had made no preparation for it, and had allowed itself to assume that preparation was unnecessary. The practice worked differently. A Stoic practitioner sitting with premeditatio malorum was not engaging in pessimism. The move was more deliberate and more specific than a general darkening of expectations. The practitioner would take something held dear, a working relationship, a possession, a pattern of daily life that had come to feel permanent, and hold it in the mind with the specific thought that it was not permanent, that it might be gone by tomorrow, that conditions had changed before and would change again. The image was held steadily, not cultivated into dread, but allowed to become clear enough to be genuinely reckoned with. What does this feel like when it is held clearly, rather than looked away from? What remains after the imagining? What the condition of that life would be concretely if the thing feared were actually removed? The purpose was not to make the present miserable by loading it with imagined futures. The purpose was the opposite. A practitioner who has genuinely imagined the loss of something dear, who has sat with that image and reckoned with its contents, returns to the present possession of the thing carrying a sharpness of appreciation that had not been there before. The morning light coming through a window is one thing when it is simply there, as mornings always are, as morning light always is. It is something else when it has been genuinely noticed, when the possibility of its absence has been briefly but clearly held, not anxiously, not dramatically, but honestly, with the steady attention of someone who knows that the fact of its presence today is not a guarantee of its presence tomorrow, and who finds that this knowledge, carried quietly, makes the present morning more fully itself. There is also something in the practice that functions as a kind of cognitive reset, a correction of a bias so ordinary that it is almost invisible. The mind that has not engaged in any preparation for adversity is not actually more peaceful than the mind that has. The unprepared mind carries the adversity as a vague, unexamined anxiety, a background worry about what might happen that is never brought into focus and therefore never diminished by scrutiny. The prepared mind has looked at the specific fear directly, has found that its contents can be examined and understood, and has moved through the most distressing versions of the imagining into something on the other side, not the elimination of concern, but the replacement of diffuse anxiety with sober and particular acknowledgement. The specific is, almost always, less frightening than the unspecified. A clearly imagined difficulty is smaller and more manageable than the shapeless dread of the unexamined future. Seneca described this not as a systematic program of self-preparation, but as a practice, something returned to regularly and held lightly. The letters to Lucilius are full of passing references to it, moments where Seneca has noticed what he stands to lose, and has spent a brief quiet interval imagining its loss before returning to the present, with the particular attentiveness that the practice produces. These references carry no urgency. They are the notes of a man who has been doing something for a long time, and has found it reliably useful, and who mentions it the way one mentions any daily practice, not with the evangelism of a convert, but with the matter-of-fact confidence of long familiarity. What all of this practice was in service of, the voluntary simplicity, and the deliberate engagement with the adversity the imagination tends to avoid, was a kind of philosophical training ground. Seneca was not composing these essays and letters for readers who had no troubles. He was composing them for people embedded in the middle of a Roman life, with all that life's genuine pressures and real entanglements, and he was arguing that the practice of philosophy was not something to be taken up once those pressures had subsided. The pressures would not subside. This was, in its own quiet way, one of the most central of his claims. The good life was not a destination that would be reached when conditions improved. The conditions were the material. The practice happened inside them, not after them, not instead of them. This was the point of the martial image he returned to in De Providentia, the essay on divine providence, and the relationship between suffering and the order of things. A soldier's strength is not demonstrated in the barracks. It is not a quality that exists independently of the conditions that call it into action. The capacity for endurance, the practical knowledge of what one can bear, the discovery that the bearing is possible at all, these things do not exist in a comfortable life as anything more than potential. They become actual only when the conditions that test them arrive. Seneca was not arguing that suffering was desirable in itself, or that the person who sought out difficulty was thereby more virtuous. He was arguing something more specific, that the person who has been through difficulty, who has met it, and found themselves still standing, who has discovered through experience, rather than argument, that the feared thing was survivable, that person carries a different kind of inner resource than the person who has not been tested, and that the philosophical practice of voluntary simplicity and advance imagining was a way of beginning that testing in conditions of one's own choosing, before fortune arrived with conditions that were not chosen at all. The figure Seneca called the sapiens, the fully wise person, was someone who had made this journey completely, who had, through long practice and genuine experience, arrived at a relationship with fortune in which the provisioning of inner resources was no longer dependent on the cooperation of external conditions. It was a demanding ideal. Seneca was entirely clear about how demanding it was, and he was also entirely clear that he himself had not met it. This candor runs through the letters with a consistency that makes them feel unusually alive. Seneca was not writing from the other side of the achievement. He was writing from somewhere in the middle of the effort, with the philosophical North Star visible but not arrived at, noting the gap between where he was and where the argument pointed, without shame and without false modesty. The gap was the honest condition of a person engaged in the practice, rather than in possession of the result. The sapiens was not intended as a description of a person who existed. Seneca sometimes wrote as though such a person might exist, might have existed, might be theoretically possible as the culmination of a life of philosophical practice. But the more he wrote, the more the figure functioned less as an achievable destination and more as a direction that organized the practice without requiring the arrival. The philosopher who spent each day attending more carefully to what was in his own power, who spent the morning hours in deliberate reflection, who practiced simplicity when simplicity was available, and premeditatio when the imagination would otherwise have occupied itself with shapeless worry. That philosopher was not wise in the sense that the sapiens was wise, but was doing the only thing available to someone who understood the argument and took it seriously, following the direction, closing the gap, slowly, with no expectation of ever closing it entirely. There is a kind of philosophical honesty in this that Seneca's letters carry in a way that more systematic philosophical writing tends not to. The letters begin in the specific and the daily. They begin with Seneca having noticed something on the way across town, or having read a line in a philosopher he admires, or having been interrupted in his thinking by a noise from the street. They begin with the day as it actually is, unrepeatable and full of small frictions, and they move from there into the philosophical reflection that the day has prompted. The effect of this, accumulated across many letters and many years, is of a man who is genuinely using philosophy rather than merely possessing it. The ideas are not displayed in those letters. They are put to work. They are brought to bear on the specific difficulty of a specific day, and the question the letters implicitly ask is not whether the philosophy is true in the abstract, but whether it helps here, now, with this, and the answer that accumulates across the letters is quiet but consistent. It does help, not by eliminating the friction, not by making the day's difficulties disappear, or by providing an argument so compelling that discomfort ceases to have any presence. The philosophy helps by changing the relationship to what is difficult. The difficulty remains. The morning remains what it is, but the mind that has practiced, that has spent time in voluntary simplicity, that has engaged in advance imagining, that has returned regularly to the question of what is genuinely within its own power, that mind moves through the same difficulties with a different quality of presence, less reactive, less disoriented, more capable of the particular kind of attention that can turn a difficulty into something useful. Seneca wrote in one of his letters that life is like a winding road, and that the person who is everywhere is nowhere. The Latin is compact and stays in the mind, nusquam est qui ubique, estimated he was writing about the habit of perpetual distraction, the scattering of attention across too many things, too many places, too many ambitions and obligations that had been accumulated without examination. The person who has tried to be everywhere, to be everything to everyone, to keep all options open, to refuse the definitive commitment to any one direction, that person arrives at the end of many busy years, having inhabited, in the deepest sense, almost nowhere. The presence required to actually live a day is not compatible with the perpetual management of too many days simultaneously. What he was pointing at in that letter, and in many others written around the same period, was the question of what it meant to claim one's own life, rather than simply passing through it, not dramatically, not through any grand renunciation of the ordinary demands of an ordinary Roman life. The claiming was quieter than that, and smaller in its daily form. It was the return, each morning, to the question of what this day was for. It was the brief practice of imagining clearly rather than worrying vaguely. It was the deliberate periods of simplicity that tested the imagination's most elaborate predictions against reality. It was the willingness to write an honest letter to a friend rather than a polished philosophical performance, to admit the distance between the sapiens and the man currently writing, to say clearly that the argument pointed in a direction that one was still traveling toward, rather than having arrived at. These practices, taken together, did not constitute a system in the sense that the Stoic tradition sometimes presented itself as a system. They were closer to a set of habits, daily and seasonal, returned to not because they had been proven to work by logical argument, but because they had been tested in the life of a man who had genuine occasion to test them and had found them holding. Seneca was a wealthy man who had lost wealth and regained it. He was a man of considerable political power who had experienced the full fragility of that kind of power. He had been ill for most of his life with a severity that made each significant illness feel potentially final. He had been sent away from everything he built and had built again from different materials in a different place. The philosophy he practiced was not an armchair construction. It had been carried through the specific conditions of a specific life, and the letters and essays that came out of that carrying retain, even across 2,000 years, the temperature of a practice rather than the coolness of theory. The day, any day, holds within it more than is ordinarily acknowledged. The morning with its particular light, the hours that are genuinely available for something chosen, the brief interval before sleep, in which, if one has learned to use it, a kind of honest accounting is possible. What was present today, what was squandered, what the day actually contained beneath the surface of its. Seneca moved through the Roman world with all its noise and political complexity and social demand, and he moved through it with this practice running underneath everything else, quiet and patient and available whenever he returned to it. The practice did not make the world simpler. It did not eliminate the noise or the demand. What it did was provide, amid all of that, a form of steady inner attention that could be returned to throughout the day, throughout the years, throughout a life. There is something in the practice of voluntary simplicity that extends beyond the specific test of bread and rough cloth. It is a practice of discovering, through direct encounter rather than through argument, the actual distance between the feared condition and the imagined condition. And that distance, when encountered honestly, tends to be one of the more quietly liberating discoveries that philosophy makes available, because the imagination that generates dread about the future is not a neutral observer, obbliques. It has its tendencies, its habitual exaggerations, its reliable overestimates of how devastating any given loss would actually be. The person who has sat with the simple life and found it sufficient has not become indifferent to better conditions. They have simply gathered evidence. They have gathered it in the most reliable form available, direct experience, and what the evidence shows is that the floor of the livable life is lower than the anxious imagination insists. And knowing where the floor is, actually knowing it rather than theorizing about it, changes the relationship to everything above it. Seneca would return to his comfortable life after the voluntary days, and he would move through it with a quality of appreciation that had not been as available before. The good bread tasted of something that the plain bread, by contrast, had clarified, of the ease of the comfortable morning, carried in it the knowledge that ease was not the baseline of survival, but a genuine good, something above the adequate minimum, something that could be received rather than merely occupied. This is perhaps the quieter gift of the practice, not just the reduced fear of loss, but the increased presence to what is currently here. The present moment, in Seneca's writing, was not treated as a philosophical abstraction. It was the specific morning, the specific table, the specific bread. It was the letter being written to Lucilius, beginning with the detail of the day, moving through the reflection the detail had prompted, arriving somewhere more considered than where it had started. The present moment was whatever was here, now, in its full particularity, before the mind moved to what was next or what had already passed. And the philosophy of adversity that Seneca built across all those years of writing was ultimately a philosophy of this, of how to be genuinely present to whatever the present moment contained, whether that was comfort or difficulty or something in between. The present moment can be owned. That was the quiet claim running through most of what Seneca wrote when he wrote at his most honest. Not the next year, not the coming season, not the life that would begin once the current arrangements had been improved. The day that was already here, the morning already underway, the hours already in motion, those things were available in a way that nothing future could be. The practice of philosophy for Seneca was largely the practice of returning to that availability, not once through some transformative insight, but daily, through the patient and repeatable work of attention. The voluntary simplicity was one form of it. The advance imagining of misfortune was another. The honest letter to a friend was another. The quiet interval before sleep, reviewing the day with neither self-punishment nor self-congratulation, was another. None of these practices required extraordinary conditions. They required only the willingness to return to them, which was itself a form of practice. The return was always available. Whatever had been given away in distraction or deferred in busyness, the return was still there, waiting with the patient indifference of something that does not require an invitation. Any day, even this one, already mostly complete, already moving toward its quiet end, contained the opportunity to reclaim, in some small and unhurried way, a few moments of genuine presence. That was not a grand achievement. It was the smallest available version of what the philosophy was pointing at, and it was, Seneca would have said, completely sufficient. Seneca begins the letter with a sound. He is sitting at the window of his villa, the afternoon light coming in at the low angle it takes in the later hours, and from the street below there is rising the particular noise of a Roman crowd, the voices of the vendors, the argument between two men somewhere out of sight, the rhythmic creak of a cartwheel turning on stone, and beneath all of it, the steady, unremarkable hum of a city that has no awareness of being observed. He sits with it for a moment. The noise does not displease him, and it does not transport him, and it does not distract him from the letter he is composing to Lucilius in the way that noise usually distracts. It simply is. The city outside the window is neither an intrusion nor a companion. It is the world proceeding along its own lines, entirely indifferent to the room and the man and the thoughts accumulating on the page in front of him. And then the letter turns. What had begun as an account of the street, its particular textures, the crowd's particular character on this afternoon, becomes the first move of a philosophical argument. The noise is the material Seneca reaches for because it is the nearest available thing, and proximity has always suited him better than abstraction. The street outside the window becomes the world beyond the mind. The mind at the window becomes the only space whose contents belong fully to the person who inhabits it. The distinction between those two things, the world proceeding along its own indifferent lines, and the mind that observes it from a room of its own making, is the hinge on which everything Seneca most deeply believed eventually turns. It would take him a long time in his life to understand how much was riding on that hinge. Fortuna, in Seneca's writing, is not a cosmic force of the kind that ancient religions sometimes produced, vast, remote, operating from a height that human aspiration cannot approach. The figure is smaller than that, and in some ways more troubling for the smallness. Seneca writes about fortune the way a person writes about someone they know well, someone they have watched across many years and have come to understand in the way that understanding is different from liking. She is playful, in his account. She is not malicious in any organized sense, but her playfulness has edges. She lifts a person to a position of visibility and comfort, and then removes the conditions that made those things possible, not out of spite, but with the casual indifference of someone who was never particularly invested in the arrangement to begin with. The queen is dethroned. The wealthy man loses his wealth. The healthy man loses his health. The advisor at the court of a prince discovers that proximity to power provides no immunity from power's whims. These are not surprising events in Seneca's world. They are the predictable behaviors of a force whose character he has had ample occasion to observe. The preparation for their arrival does not require unusual courage or particular philosophical sophistication. It requires only the honest acknowledgement that the force operates the way it operates, that it has always operated this way, and that the person who has been watching long enough to see the pattern clearly will be able, when the moment comes, to recognize it rather than be ambushed by it. There is a particular quality to the experience of being ambushed. Seneca returns to it across many letters and essays. The shock of loss is not simply the loss itself. It is the gap between the loss and the expectation, the collision between what fortune has delivered and what the mind had, without examination, assumed was stable. When a person has been living as though health were a permanent possession rather than a borrowed condition, the arrival of serious illness carries a double weight, the weight of the illness and the weight of the collapse of an assumption that was never warranted in the first place. When a person has been living as though a political position or a friendship or a period of creative productivity were the fixed furniture of existence rather than arrangements of circumstances, always subject to rearrangement, the loss of those things, when it comes, produces a disorientation that exceeds what the loss itself would warrant. Seneca's point is not that the loss does not matter. His point is that the disorientation does not have to be part of it. A mind that has been genuinely attending to the character of Fortuna, studying her patterns, acknowledging her operating methods, receiving her gifts with the quiet caveat that gifts of this kind come with no warranty and no permanence, is a mind that can meet her changes of direction with something closer to recognition than catastrophe, not without grief, not without the real weight of what is lost, but without the additional and avoidable suffering of someone who believed until the last possible moment that things would always continue as they were. This is the philosophical project that runs beneath every one of Seneca's letters, every one of his essays, every consolation addressed to a friend in difficulty, not to eliminate the experience of loss, but to remove from that experience the unnecessary suffering added by a mind that was never honestly prepared. The Stoic school had a way of sorting the world that helped enormously with this. It was not a complicated sorting mechanism. It did not require years of study or a particular kind of philosophical training to understand and outline, though the application of it, the genuine practiced day-to-day application, was the work of a lifetime, and even those who devoted their lives to it reported imperfect results. The sorting was this: among all the things that exist and occur and matter to a human life, some belong to us in the deepest possible sense, and some do not. What belongs to us is the quality of our own rational judgments, the direction of our own willing, the values we hold, and the consistency with which we apply them in the moments of actual decision, the character of our own attention, what we attend to, how long we hold it, what we allow to constitute the texture of inner experience. These things in the Stoic account are genuinely ours, not because the world cannot interfere with them, it can and frequently does, but because the interference requires our cooperation to fully succeed. A person can be silenced. They cannot, without their own assent, be made to believe something they have judged to be false. A person can be exiled. They cannot, without their own assent, be stripped of the inner orientation that makes exile into an occasion for philosophy rather than a defeat. What does not belong to us is everything else. Health, in the last analysis, belongs to the body's own processes and to the external conditions that sustain or threaten those processes. Reputation belongs to the judgments of other people, which are subject to their own histories, their own fears, their own unreliable assessments. Wealth is borrowed from circumstances, from the continued operation of markets and properties and relationships that no single person controls or fully understands. Even the people we love, the presence of the people we love, belongs not to us, but to the continuation of conditions that always contain the seed of their own change. The Stoic term for this category, the things that do not belong to us, the things that lie beyond the boundary of our genuine authority, is uk ephemine, not up to us. The other category, the one that holds the rational will in its quality, is ephemine, up to us. The distinction sounds clean when stated in those terms. In the actual experience of a human life, lying awake thinking about money, or health, or whether a friendship has cooled, or whether the work one has put years into will come to anything, the line between those two categories blurs constantly and requires constant redrawing. That redrawing is the philosophical practice Seneca returned to every day, not as a solution to be achieved and then maintained, but as an activity that needed doing again each morning, each evening, each time Fortuna announced a new configuration of the furniture, and a prepared mind needed to assess which of its concerns were responses to genuine losses in the Ephemon domain, and which were distress over the Uk-Ephemon realm behaving, as it always eventually did, like itself. There is an image Seneca found useful for the question of whether freedom and fate can coexist. The question of whether a life thoroughly determined by forces outside individual control leaves any genuine space for the kind of sovereignty the Stoic tradition was describing. A dog is tied to a cart by a lead of fixed length. The cart is moving in a direction and at a pace not chosen by the dog. The dog will travel with the cart. There is no alternative road available, no means by which the dog might redirect the cart according to its own preferences, no speed at which the dog can run that will outpace the arrangement it is fastened to. The cart goes where it goes, the dog goes with it, and yet the dog that trots alongside the cart willingly, with the easy movement of an animal that has accepted the arrangement and found within it the full expression of its own nature, is experiencing the journey differently from the dog that fights the lead, that strains against the direction, that exhausts itself resisting a movement it cannot prevent. Both dogs travel the same road. Both dogs arrive at the same destination. The freedom available in this arrangement is not freedom from the journey, it is freedom in the quality of the movement. The willing dog is not less determined than the drag dog. The willing dog is expressing its own nature, working with the structure rather than against it, inhabiting the necessity rather than suffering it. This was not, for Seneca, a consolation prize. The freedom it described was genuine freedom, not the freedom of an uncaused agent operating outside the causal structure of the universe, which was a kind of freedom no philosopher had ever found evidence for, but the freedom that consists in acting from one's own deepest rational nature, moving with the structure of things, because one has understood the structure of things well enough to recognize one's own place in it. The universe in the Stoic account is not indifferent, it is ordered, not ordered in the narrow sense of an administrative system designed to serve human preferences, but ordered in the sense of being pervaded by a single rational principle, the logos, that runs through all matter and all events, organizing the whole into something coherent. Individual human reason is not separate from this principle. It is an expression of it, a small and temporary instance of the larger rationality that constitutes the universe's most fundamental structure. When a human mind acts from its own deepest rational nature, it is not acting in opposition to the universe's order, it is participating in it. This changes the experience of adversity considerably. A misfortune that arrives in a universe understood to be merely indifferent is a collision, the self against an impersonal process that neither intends harm nor offers meaning. A misfortune that arrives in a universe understood to be rationally ordered is something else. It is still a loss. It is still something the human mind, feeling the weight of it, registers as difficult, but it arrives in a context, not the forced context of optimism, the cheerful insistence that everything happens for a reason, and the reason will be pleasant, but the more austere and more durable context of a cosmos whose order includes and requires the full range of what fortune distributes. Seneca does not pretend this is easy. His letters are not written from a position of someone who has achieved equanimity and is now reporting back on what the view is like from there. They are written from a position much more honest than that, a position of someone still engaged in the daily work of applying philosophical principles to conditions that resist application, still finding the gap between what Stoic philosophy teaches and what his own mind does when fortune changes the arrangements, still interested in the question of how to narrow that gap by small, repeatable daily increments rather than by the single stroke of philosophical conversion. Writing to Lucilius across the years of those letters, Seneca is not composing a system. He is conducting a correspondence. The letters move from the specific to the general and back again with the associative logic of someone who begins, most morning, with whatever is immediately in front of them, the noise from the street, the behavior of a crowd at the games, the particular exhaustion of a day spent meeting obligations that have nothing to do with philosophy, and works from there toward the principles that make those small observations philosophically resonant. Each letter is a walk taken in company, The arrival at the end is not the point. The point is the quality of movement across the ground, and the ground for Seneca is always this: the mind and its contents are the only domain in which sovereign authority is genuinely possible, and that sovereignty is not a possession, but a practice, not an achievement, but a direction of travel, not a destination reached at the end of sufficient study, but a capacity made stronger by every honest application and weakened by every evasion. The political context in which Seneca composed those letters gives the question of inner sovereignty a weight that abstract philosophy sometimes lacks. He was advising Nero. He was doing so in a court where the emperor's absolute power was the fundamental structural fact of every relationship, every ambition, every arrangement that anyone in Rome had made or planned to make. In that context, in the court of a man who could exile, who could condemn, who could reach into the arrangements of any life and rearrange them by decree, the Stoic claim that the inner life remained genuinely free was not an intellectual position held at comfortable remove from its consequences. It was a practical orientation that one either brought into that room or did not bring, and the consequences of not bringing it were of a philosophical kind long before they became of any other kind. The inner citadel. The phrase appears in different forms across the Stoic tradition, and what it names is not a fortress of cold detachment or the armored posture of someone who has decided to feel nothing that the world can reach. It names something warmer than that, and something more specific. It names the space of the rational mind that knows its own contents, that has examined what it values, clarified what it genuinely holds, and identified which of its responses to fortune belong to the Ephalm-Tierman domain, and which are reactions to the Ephalm-Tierman world, behaving as it does, unpredictably. That space, in Seneca's account, is not built by effort alone. It is arrived at by attention, by the honest, patient, sustained attention of a person who has decided to take their own inner life seriously enough to actually look at it, not to curate it, not to perform it, not to measure it against an ideal of composure that functions as its own kind of vanity, but to look at it with the calm forensic interest of someone who genuinely wants to know what is there. And what is there, when that attention is genuinely brought to bear, turns out to be something more reliable than the structures fortune can dismantle. Not because it is permanent. The Stoics were not claiming that the mind outlasts the body, or that whatever the rational will achieves in a lifetime is immune to the passage of time. They were claiming something narrower and more verifiable than that the quality of a mind's engagement with its own experience in the present moment is the only thing that fortune does not directly control, and that this is enough, that this, the quality of one's own attention, the consistency of one's own values, the ability to meet what arrives with a response that belongs to reason rather than to the unexamined momentum of fear or desire, is sufficient ground for a life that could be called, in the Stoic sense, genuinely free. Seneca at his window, the street below still carrying its unremarkable noise, is not detached from the city. He is not withdrawn into a philosophical interior that has no contact with the world. He is in contact with the world, receiving its sounds, noting its texture, finding in the specific grain of an ordinary afternoon the material for a philosophical letter that will travel across the miles to Lucilius and arrive as a document of daily attention rather than systematic instruction. The window is not a wall between the mind and the world. It is a frame, and the frame is the only thing the philosopher makes. What the ephenmene, uk ephenmene distinction offers, in practice, is not peace, not the smooth, unbroken surface of a life insulated from difficulty. What it offers is something more angular and more useful, a method for sorting anxiety at its source. Each fear, when it arises, has an address. It belongs either to the domain of what can be influenced by the quality of one's own response, or to the domain of what will proceed as it will proceed regardless. The fears that belong to the first domain are worth attending to, not because attending to them guarantees a better outcome, but because the quality of attention is precisely the thing that is genuinely up to us. And bringing it to bear on those fears is the exercise of the only authority that fortune cannot revoke. The fears that belong to the second domain can be acknowledged, can be felt with whatever weight they carry, and can then be set down, not suppressed, not denied, but released from the grip of the will that has been treating them as problems requiring solution when they are in fact conditions requiring acceptance. This is harder than it sounds. Seneca is the first to say so. The letters are full of his own difficulty with it, the moments when he recognizes that he has been striving for something that belongs entirely to the Ukafeniman domain, investing the focused energy of his rational will in outcomes that the rational will cannot control, experiencing the particular exhaustion that comes from applying effort in a direction that contains no purchase. The recognition does not make the striving stop immediately. What it does is introduce a pause, and the pause is the beginning of the sorting. There is a difference between the philosopher who writes about freedom under constraint from a position of comfortable security and the philosopher who writes about it while actually navigating constraint. Seneca writes about it while navigating constraint. His letters from the final years, composed as his relationship with Nero deteriorated, as the possibility of forced death moved from an abstract philosophical subject to a practical near-term condition, are not the letters of someone whose philosophy failed when it was most tested. They are the letters of someone whose philosophy was being applied to exactly the conditions it was designed for, with the imperfect but genuine application of a person who has been practicing for this and knows that the practice has made a difference, even if the difference is not the difference of complete composure and perfect equanimity. Lucilius receives letters about freedom, about the good that cannot be taken away, about the inner resources that survive the removal of external conditions, not because Seneca is performing wisdom for the benefit of a correspondent, but because writing those letters is itself the philosophical practice, the act of articulating the position carefully, of finding the most honest form of the argument, of holding the principles up to the light of actual conditions, and seeing what they look like when the conditions are genuinely difficult. Philosophy conducted in safety is one thing. Philosophy conducted from within the conditions it addresses is something else, and the difference shows in the prose. The prose does not perform. It thinks out loud. It circles back. It admits doubt and returns to the position, and admits doubt again, and finds in the return is something more reliable than certainty, a direction of travel that holds even when the certainty does not, a practice that continues even when the practitioner cannot claim to have arrived at the destination the practice is pointing toward. Nasquam est qui ubique, estimative. The person who is everywhere is nowhere. This small sentence from Seneca's letters carries more weight than its brevity suggests. Its first application is to the habit of spreading attention across too many concerns, too many places, too many ambitions and anxieties and peripheral engagements, the scattered life that is full of motion and empty of presence, the person who moves constantly from one thing to the next without fully inhabiting any of them, the life lived everywhere and therefore in the philosophically relevant sense, lived nowhere. But the sentence reaches further than attention management. The person who is everywhere is nowhere because being somewhere, really being in a place, a time, a life, requires the decision to be there, to bring one's actual self to the actual moment, and let the actual moment constitute real experience, rather than marking time until some future configuration of circumstances becomes worthy of full attention, the life deferred until conditions improve, the presence withheld until the situation feels settled, the philosophical work postponed until the external arrangements are more favorable. These are the ways in which a person can be present in body while nowhere in any deeper sense, everywhere in the sense of having no location that is genuinely inhabited, each moment passed through rather than met. The inner citadel is not a place to retreat to when the world becomes too much. That is a misreading of what it names. It is the place from which one goes into the world, the stable orientation from which engagement becomes possible, rather than overwhelming, the maintained clarity about what belongs to the Ephedhaming domain that makes it possible to be present to the Ephedhaming world without being lost in it. A person who has located their own center can move out from that center into the full difficulty of actual conditions, into political complexity, into the noise of the street, into the genuine weight of grief and loss, and the unpredictable behavior of fortune and return, because the center remains. Seneca, writing at his window, knows the city is doing what cities do. He knows that the arrangement of his life, the proximity to power, the wealth, the philosophical productivity, the friendship of Lucilius, conducted across the miles, is an arrangement that Fortuna holds and has always held, one configuration among the many she has offered him and revoked across a long and unusually eventful life. He knows this not as a philosopher who has studied the material carefully and arrived at an intellectual position, but as a person who has lived through the evidence. The knowledge is biographical before it is doctrinal. It sits in him as something closer to experience than to argument. And from that knowledge, from the window, from the particular noise of this particular afternoon, the letter continues. Fortuna's gifts, he writes somewhere in those years of letters, should be received with open hands, not clutched. The open hand can receive more, and it can release without the tearing that comes when something held too tightly is removed. The open hand is not indifferent. The open hand is present. The open hand knows what it is holding, and holds it with the clear understanding that holding is not owning, that the gift was lent rather than given, that when it is recalled, there is no violation of an agreement that was never made. This metaphor runs quietly through the whole of Seneca's philosophical life. The open hand, the held lightly, the willingness to be in possession of the goods that fortune provides without being defined by them, without building an identity that requires their continuation, without treating the stability of external circumstances as the ground of inner stability, because the ground of inner stability, in the Stoic account, is elsewhere. It is in the quality of rational attention, in the consistency of considered values, in the practiced ability to sort what arrives. This belongs to me in the deepest sense. This does not. This is worth my genuine effort. This I can hold with an open hand and release when the time comes. The cart moves. The road was already laid. The dog that knows the arrangement, that has studied it, that has stopped straining against the lead and begun instead to move with the full expression of its own nature alongside the cart's direction, that dog is not defeated. That dog has found, within the structure of a thoroughly determined situation, the only freedom that was ever actually available. Not the freedom of being uncaused, the freedom of being fully, coherently, genuinely oneself. The afternoon light shifts as Seneca sits. The noise from the street changes character slightly. The vendors less numerous now, the footfall thinner, the city beginning the slow adjustment from the business of midday to the different business of the evening. The letter in front of him has moved from the street to the mind, from the mind to the question of what belongs to the mind, from that question to the image of Fortuna and her predictable methods, from there to the sorting, the distance between Afhemen and Uk Afhemen, the daily work of drawing that line again and working on the right side of it. He sets the pen down. The window is still there. The street is still proceeding. The city is doing what it does. There is a quality of attention that neither the street nor the city nor the full reach of Fortuna's arrangements can enter and rearrange, not because it is armored, not because it refuses contact with the world outside the window, but because it has found its own center, has practiced finding it long enough that the finding, on most days, takes less effort than it once did, and the center, once genuinely found, has a kind of quiet permanence that does not depend on what is happening to the furniture. Not built tonight, not requiring construction, already present in any mind that is turned toward it with honest attention. The sovereignty that was always available, waiting to be recognized rather than achieved, inhabited simply by the quality of looking, not at the street, not at fortune's current configuration, not at the long list of everything that is not up to us, but inward, at the only domain where the question of governance is still genuinely open and the answer still genuinely belongs to the one who is asking. Marcia was sitting near a window in her Roman household on an afternoon that had probably looked like other afternoons, the light coming through at the low angle of the later hours, the room arranged as rooms are arranged when a life has continued around a wound for 3 years without quite knowing how. The scroll had arrived from Seneca. Her hands held it, the way hands hold something they are not yet certain they want to open. 3 years of grief, not fresh grief, not the sharp first rupture of it, but the longer and in some ways more exhausting kind, the grief that has become a fixture of the rooms it lives in, familiar as the furniture, resistant now to the consolations of friends who have mostly stopped offering them. She opened the scroll. The first words she read were not what she expected. Seneca told her that her son had been lent to her, not given. Lent. The word sits differently from what grief tends to assume, which is that what was loved was in some fundamental sense possessed, held by right, and therefore wrongly taken. What is borrowed, Seneca was suggesting, belongs to a lender who retains the right to call it back, and nature, in his account, is exactly this kind of lender, patient and finally irresistible, extending everything it extends on terms that were always temporary, always conditional, always already understood somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary living. The claim does not dissolve grief. It meets grief with a counterclaim about the nature of ownership, and the first response is almost always resistance. The feeling that a beloved face is being reduced to something borrowed and returned, that the philosophical reframing is doing violence to the particular and irreplaceable weight of the person who is gone. Marcia would have felt that resistance. Seneca expected her to. He was not writing to someone he thought would receive a philosophical argument and be immediately freed from 3 years of accumulated sorrow. He was writing to someone he thought was ready, after 3 years, to find the grief beginning to outlast its own useful work, and who might, on a particular afternoon, be willing to sit with a different way of holding what had happened. There is a kind of exhaustion that becomes available only after grief has had time to run its full course, and Seneca was not trying to shorten that course. He was arriving at what he hoped was its later edge, with a hand extended, not toward the wound, but toward the possibility of what might come after it. The essay he sent her is called the Consolatio ad Marcium, and it is one of the earliest pieces of extended philosophical writing he produced. It is addressed to a real woman in a real situation, someone whose son Metilius had died, and whose grief had persisted long enough that those around her had grown concerned. The consolation it offers is not simple. It is not the reassurance of a sympathetic friend, suggesting that time heals everything, or that the dead have gone somewhere pleasant. Seneca's consolation is harder, and in the long run, more durable than that. It asks Marcia to look at what she thought she had, what any of us think we have, in the people and circumstances we love, and to consider whether the model of ownership she had been using was ever an accurate one. Nature extends itself into temporary forms. Individual lives are among those forms. The person we love is a concentration of something that existed before them and continues after them, briefly gathered into the particular shape of that face, that voice, that set of habits and qualities that became indispensable to someone who did not choose to have them become indispensable. And then the gathering disperses. The form returns to what formed it. The particular concentration loosens and dissolves back into the larger whole from which it was briefly drawn. This is not a cold account. Seneca was not offering it as a reason not to love deeply, or not to feel the loss of the specific shape that love had taken. He was offering it as a way of understanding what the loss is, not the cancellation of something that should have persisted indefinitely, but the completion of something that was always, at every moment of its existence, a temporary expression of a permanent principle. The Consolatio ad Marcium ends with an image that Seneca builds slowly through its final passages. He imagines Marcia's deceased father, himself a man who had died, speaking from beyond the outermost boundary of the cosmos, from the place where the individual soul has returned to the rational whole that generated it. The Father sees what cannot be seen from inside a human life, the full shape of time, the movement of all things through their cycles, the small and ordinary scale of what had seemed from within it to be irreparable catastrophe. He speaks not to diminish what Marcia has lost, but to situate it, to place it inside a view of things large enough that the loss does not disappear, but is held by something that can hold it. And he speaks of Metilius not as lost, but as arrived, not into darkness or nothingness, but into the vast and continuing rational whole, from which he was briefly differentiated, and to which all differentiated things are eventually and inevitably returned. The image asks something difficult of the reader. It asks for a kind of imaginative extension beyond the ordinary borders of human perspective, a willingness to hold the death of someone loved inside a view that is larger than the love itself, larger than the grief it produced, larger than the human capacity to assign meaning to individual loss. This is precisely the kind of reach that Stoic philosophy was built to make possible, and precisely the kind of reach that feels at the first encounter like it is asking too much. Marcia, reading the scroll on her ordinary afternoon, was not being asked to stop loving her son. She was being asked to consider whether the love she had carried for 3 years, turned inward toward its own loss, might be ready to open outward toward the larger whole that had contained him and that contained her still. Something shifts in a person when grief has been held long enough that it becomes more familiar than the life that preceded it. The familiar grief, at that point, has itself become a kind of home, and leaving it feels like a second loss. Seneca understood this. He did not tell Marcia that her grief was excessive, or that she had mourned too long, or that the philosophical resources he was offering should have been applied sooner. He told her that she was ready, that 3 years was its own honest duration, that what he was offering now was not a correction, but a door, one that had perhaps been there for some time, visible only when the long work of grieving had done what it needed to do and left a space that something else could enter. The Stoic philosophers understood grief not as an error of feeling, but as a particular kind of cognitive judgment, an evaluation of what has happened that places the highest possible weight on the loss of something external, as if the person who is gone had been the source of the griever's own completion. In the Stoic account, emotions of this kind, what the philosophers called the pathé, the disruptive passions, are not involuntary eruptions that arrive from outside the self and overwhelm it. They are assessments, judgments made, often rapidly and without examination, about the value of what has been lost and the threat of what remains. This does not make them trivial. It makes them in principle revisable, not by suppression, not by the forced replacement of grief with something more cheerful, but by the slow and honest examination of the assumptions embedded in them. The assumption buried inside acute grief for the death of someone beloved is something like this: that the dead person was essential to the griever's capacity to live a full and worthwhile life, and that without them something necessary has been permanently removed. The Stoic philosophers looked at this assumption carefully and found it, on examination, to be a form of what they called a false judgment, not false because the love was false, not false because the loss was not real, but false in its implicit claim about where the griever's capacity for goodness and fullness actually resides. That capacity, the Stoics held, is interior. It belongs to the rational nature of the person who is grieving, not to any external circumstance or relationship, however deep and genuine. The love is real, the loss is real, the judgment that the loss has removed something without which goodness is impossible is the peace that does not survive examination. This is where Stoic philosophy meets grief with something harder and more respectful than simple comfort. It does not say the grief was wrong. It does not say the love that produced it was misplaced. It says that inside the grief is an assumption about where the self is located, outside itself, in the thing it has lost, and that this assumption, gently and honestly examined, opens the possibility of a different understanding of what the self actually is and where its resources actually live. The philosophers who worked through this were not people who had never lost anyone. Marcus Aurelius lost children. Seneca lost friends, students, colleagues to political violence, to illness, to the ordinary and extraordinary attritions of a long and turbulent life. The philosophical position was not composed in the absence of experience. It was worked out in the presence of it, tested against real loss, and found, not always immediately, not without difficulty, to hold. The Stoic word for what replaces the disruptive emotions, the pathe, the distorting passions, is eupathei, the well-ordered or rational emotions. The wise person in the Stoic account is not emotionless. This is one of the most persistent misreadings of the tradition, and it was already a persistent misreading in Seneca's own time. The Stoic ideal was not the flat face and the unresponsive heart. It was something more like the response of a person who has learned to feel what is proportionate, who feels genuine joy in the presence of what is genuinely good, genuine wish for what is genuinely worth wishing for, genuine caution before genuine threats, without being overwhelmed by evaluations that assign to external circumstances a power over inner life that they do not, by the nature of things, actually possess. The grief that Seneca was helping Marcia through was not going to end in the absence of feeling. It was going to end in a different quality of feeling, one anchored not in the false premise that Metilius had been the source of her goodness, but in the true premise that she was, and had always been, her own most fundamental dwelling. Seneca knew what he was asking. He knew it from the inside, not only from philosophical argument. He was a person who had been ill for much of his life, seriously ill, with the kind of illness that announces itself dramatically and lingers with exhausting constancy. He had asthma and what was most likely tuberculosis, and there were periods in which his condition was severe enough that he could not breathe without difficulty, when the breath that is the most ordinary fact of being alive became the thing his body was actively fighting to accomplish. He wrote about one such attack in what is now known as Letter 54 of the Epistulae Moralis, the long series of letters addressed to his friend Lucilius. And what he wrote does not read like the composed reflection of a philosopher observing his own distress from a careful distance. It reads like someone who was genuinely frightened, who felt what he described as the approach of death, who reached for the philosophical resources available to him, not because it was easy to reach for them, but because they were the only tools he had. During the attack, unable to breathe, he turned to something that the Stoic tradition had taught him and that he had practiced long enough that it was genuinely available to him in that moment, the practice of placing the present difficulty inside the longest available frame. He had survived previous attacks. Each one that he had feared might be final, had not been. This one might be. If it was, he reflected, he would be going where all the dead had already gone, not into some unprecedented darkness, but into the same place that had already received everyone who had ever drawn breath and stopped. There was a kind of companionship in that thought, a leveling of the loneliness of the dying moment. He was not going somewhere new. He was following everyone who had preceded him, which is to say, everyone who had ever lived. And if it was not the final attack, if the breath came back as it had come back before, then he would have practiced something real, and the next time would find him a little less unprepared. He called it meditatio mortis, a rehearsal for death, not a morbid exercise, not a performance of philosophical courage, but a practical preparation, the cognitive equivalent of the volunteer simplicity he practiced in other domains, the deliberate entry into the feared condition in order to discover that the feared condition is endurable, that it contains less absolute terror than the imagination, left unchecked, insists it must. The imagination has a tendency toward catastrophe. It projects what it fears onto the future and treats the projection as a certainty, and then lives in the shadow of that projected certainty as if the catastrophe had already arrived. The practice of genuine confrontation, of actually sitting with the worst version of the feared thing, of holding it clearly rather than flinching away from it, tends to reveal that the projection was larger than the reality. Not always, not in every case, but often enough that the practice of honest confrontation turns out to be more useful than the practice of avoidance, which never reduces the fear but only defers it. What Seneca found during that asthma attack, what he reported finding, was not a philosophical argument that made the difficulty disappear. It was a quality of attention that made the difficulty bearable. The breath was not coming easily. The body was distressed. None of that changed. What changed was the relationship between the distress and the self that was experiencing it, the small but significant shift from being entirely inside the fear to holding the fear at the distance of a clear and honest gaze. This is what the long practice of philosophy was for, in Seneca's account, not the production of beautiful arguments or the memorization of doctrinal positions, but the cultivation of a quality of attention that is available in the moments that most require it. The philosophy has to be lived to be useful. Arguments read and set aside, are decorative, arguments practiced daily, turned over in the mind in ordinary moments, made habits of the will rather than merely habits of thought. These are the arguments that are present when the breath does not come, when the loss arrives, when the long arc of a life arrives at the place it has always been heading. The nightly examination of conscience that Seneca practiced and described in De Ura is one of the clearest examples of this kind of daily, practiced, habitual philosophy. He adapted it from a practice attributed to the Pythagorean teacher Quintus Sextius, who had taught that the end of each day was an appropriate time to review it, not with self-punishment, not with the sharp edge of self-reproach, but with the calm and honest attention of a person who cares about the quality of their own inner life and is willing to look at it without flinching and without flattery. 3 questions, asked quietly and seriously before sleep. Where did things go wrong today? What was done well? What might be done better? Not a trial, not a performance of virtuous self-examination. A practice, the same practice repeated nightly, building across the accumulated evenings of a life into something like a consistent and honest relationship with one's own actions and one's own nature. The questions are not demanding in their form. The discipline is in the asking of them with genuine attention, night after night, in the specific darkness of one's own room, with the day still close enough to be seen clearly. Where did things go wrong today? The question is neither self-punishing nor self-exculpating. It does not assume the worst, but it does not allow comfortable evasion. Something probably went wrong in some small or larger way. Most days contain a moment in which the quality of attention lapsed. The response was less considered than it might have been. The impatience won over the patience. The smaller concern crowded out the larger one. To notice this without catastrophizing it, to see it clearly, set it down honestly, and move on rather than amplifying it into evidence of fundamental moral failure, is itself a philosophical accomplishment. The Stoics were not perfectionists. They believed in the sapiens, the fully wise person, but they held that ideal at an honest distance, and Seneca was more honest than most about how far from it he understood himself to remain. What was done well today? This question is, in its own way, as demanding as the first. It requires a kind of honest self-credit that is neither vanity nor mere comfort-seeking, the accurate recognition that some things in the day were done with genuine attention, genuine care, genuine quality of will. Seneca was not a philosopher of self-abnegation. Aniolini plasgrid, dat yorwichtit but propos, but the Senecas and forconsum. He did not think that the wise life was characterized by the continuous suppression of self-recognition. He thought it was characterized by accurate perception of faults and of strengths, of failures and of genuine successes, held in the clear and steady light of honest attention. The person who cannot accurately credit what they have done well is as far from wisdom in the Stoic account as the person who cannot accurately acknowledge what they have done poorly. Both are failing at the fundamental task, which is to see clearly and what might be done better. The question opens toward tomorrow without demanding it, touches the future lightly, and then returns to the present, to the moment of the review, to the particular evening and the particular room where the day is being honestly gathered and set down before sleep. This is not resolution. It is not the closing of an account. It is the small, repeatable gesture of a person who takes their own inner life seriously enough to attend to it before releasing it into the night, who refuses both the defensive closing off of genuine self-examination and the punishing prolongation of it, who finds the narrow and honest middle ground between them and rests there. Seneca wrote about this practice in De Ira, the treatise on anger, because anger was the emotion he found himself most in need of examining, the one that moved most quickly, that left the least space between impulse and action, that most easily disrupted the quality of attention he was trying to maintain. He was not a man who found the Stoic ideal easy. He was, by his own report, a man of considerable passion, impatience, and attachment to the things he thought he held lightly. The philosophical writing is not the testimony of someone who achieved the ideal and is recording the experience of having done so. It is the testimony of someone in the middle of the attempt, someone for whom the daily examination was not the celebration of virtue accomplished, but the honest reckoning with virtue, imperfectly pursued, and who thought that the honest reckoning was itself valuable, was in fact the actual practice, rather than a sign that the practice had not yet been completed. To end each day this way, with the three honest questions, asked with genuine rather than performed attention, is to treat sleep not as an interruption of the philosophical life, but as a natural completion of its daily cycle. The day is reviewed. What can be learned from it is learned. What needs to be set down is set down, and then the mind releases its hold on the day's concerns, not because they do not matter, but because the nightly review has done what it can do, and further holding is neither honest nor useful. Sleep, in this understanding, is not the cessation of the philosophical life. It is the restoring of it, the interval in which the mind that has been attending all day is allowed to release its attention, to dissolve the particular shape of the day's concerns back into the larger and quieter whole, from which another day will be drawn. The Stoic account of what grief is, a false judgment, in principle revisable, does not require the grieving person to feel no grief. It requires them to understand, eventually, what the grief is made of, and to look honestly at the assumption embedded in it about where the self is located and where its goodness actually lives. The same is true of the asthma attack, the exile, the political entrapment, the forced death, every form of adversity that Seneca encountered or contemplated in his long philosophical life. The philosophy does not promise that the adversity will be easy. It promises that the adversity is knowable, that its structure can be understood, its limits discerned, its most devastating assumption examined and found, on careful inspection, not to be what it first appeared. Not a cancellation of the self, but a test of where the self has been living, in fortune or in the quality of its own rational attention. There is an image at the end of the consolatio, ad Marcium, that stays. Marcia's father speaks from beyond the outermost boundary of things, and what he describes is not an afterlife in the ordinary sense, not a place of reward or rest or reunion in the familiar human sense of those words. He describes the view from outside the partiality that individual human lives impose on the perception of things. He describes what it is like to see without the distortion of attachment, without the terror of loss, without the urgency that finite time produces in every finite creature. He describes the arrival of Metilius not as something to be mourned from below, but as something to be understood from above, the return of a temporary concentration of the rational whole to the rational whole itself, neither diminished nor erased, but dissolved back into the larger presence from which it was briefly drawn. The image asks the reader to imagine a perspective they do not have access to from inside a human life. This is, in a sense, the impossible ask that runs through all of Seneca's philosophy of adversity. The request to hold one's own situation from a view wider than the self that is experiencing it, to see the particular and pressing concerns of a human life from the angle of a cosmos that contains them without being contained by them. The ask is impossible in its complete form. No human being fully inhabits the view from beyond the outermost boundary, but the partial version of it, the willingness to hold the present difficulty inside a wider frame, to ask what this looks like from the longer view, to resist the urgency that makes every loss feel like the last and largest thing, this partial version is not impossible. It is precisely what the daily practice of philosophy is designed to make available, accumulated gradually over the course of a life until it is genuinely present when most needed. Seneca was a man who practiced imperfectly across an imperfect life. He was wealthy in a philosophy that counseled lightness of attachment to wealth. He was entangled in power in a philosophy that counseled the cultivation of an inner life, impervious to power's demands. He fell short of the ideal he wrote about, and he wrote about falling short with a candor that is itself a kind of philosophical achievement, the refusal to pretend, in the writing, to a wisdom that the life had not fully realized. The sapiens, the fully wise person, was a direction of travel rather than an achieved destination. What mattered was the continued turning of the self toward that direction, the daily review and daily renewal of the attempt, the willingness to be honest about the gap between aspiration and reality, rather than closing the gap fictionally by claiming to have already arrived. What he left in the letters to Lucilius, in the Consolations, in the treatises on anger and on mercy and on the brevity of life, is not a record of achieved wisdom. It is something more valuable and more honest than that. It is the record of a sustained attempt, made under real conditions of illness and political danger and impending death, to live according to principles that were genuinely held and genuinely difficult to hold. The philosophy was not composed in safety. It was tested against exactly the conditions it was addressing, and if it did not emerge from those conditions perfectly intact, it emerged from them with its fundamental integrity visible, the integrity of a practice that was never about perfection, but about the quality of the attempt. What the Stoic Nightly Review finally is, beneath its practical form, is an act of honesty toward the self at the end of each day. To sit with the three questions in the dark is to say, I was here today. I was here in particular ways, with particular qualities of attention and particular failures of it. I saw some things clearly and some things not clearly. I acted from my better nature in some moments and from a less examined part of myself in others. And none of this is catastrophic, and none of it is to be dismissed, and all of it is the material of a philosophical life, not the ideal version, but the actual one, the one that can be honestly examined and honestly released into the night. The breath continues in the sleeping body. It continues without instruction, without effort, without the direction of the will. The most fundamental and automatic expression of the fact that life persists, even when the particular concerns of a particular day have been released into sleep. Seneca, at the end of his life, waiting in a room he knew would be the last one, with the scribes present and the weeping friends addressed with words that were as composed as he could make them, was breathing. The breath was the fact that preceded every philosophical thought he had ever had, and would persist as it persists in every sleeping body, through every night, slightly beyond the point where philosophical thought was still required. Equanimity, in the end, is not a philosophical position. It is what the philosophical positions have been building toward, not an argument but a quality, the quality of a mind that has sat long enough with difficulty, that difficulty has become, not easy, but genuinely familiar. The strange calm that emerges from that familiarity is not detachment. It is not the flat removal of feeling from experience.